Hi there, art nerds. Merry after Christmas. So earlier in December, I shared a tutorial where I showed you guys how to draw and ink your very own gingerbread house. Today, I'm going to add some lovely festive color to this gingerbread house using Karin Water-Based Brushmarker Pro markers. This is absolutely not a sponsored video. Everything shown in this video was purchased out of my own pocket and done of my own volition. I just happen to like Karin brush markers. I thought that was worth noting. Just because sometimes there can be a little bit of ambiguity about those sort of things, and I always try to be really clear about what and what isn't sent care of or sponsored on this channel. So here is a peek from the last video. In case you guys missed it, I highly recommend you check it out if you're interested in designing and drawing your own gingerbread houses. They're a lot easier than you think. It's all about drawing in lots of tasty, candy-coated details. I'll be sure to pop a link down in the description below where you can find this tutorial, as well as a list of all the materials you'll need for this demonstration. You don't have to use Karin water-based markers. There are a lot of different water-based and watercolor markers that would work well for this technique. In fact, you might even be able to use good old Crayola markers for this. I've got a few tutorials where I show you guys how to use Crayola markers as watercolor markers. They're a great, inexpensive alternative to more expensive watercolor markers. So I'll be sure to drop that tutorial down in the description below for you guys as well. But if you already have some Karin brush markers, this is a great, very easy technique that'll let you get a really wide range of shades and tones out of your markers. If you have Ecoline markers or any other dye-based watercolor markers, these techniques will be pretty similar for those as well. So one of the keys here is we are inking with a waterproof brush pen. We're using the Tombow Fudenosuke brush pens as well as the Sakura Pigma FB brush pens. They're both waterproof. And we're also inking on watercolor paper. In this case, it is the Blick Studio watercolor pad, a very inexpensive cellulose pad. Canson Montval, Canson XL would also work well for this. So here are our supplies, our inked piece. If you just want to relax in color, I'll have a link in the description where you can purchase the line art. If you're already supporting my work on Patreon, you get the line art for free, so check Patreon for that. Feel free to print it out and color it. If you're working along at home, I would recommend, if you're doing watercolor, that you print it out on at least 90-pound watercolor paper, probably with a toner-based printer. Toner is not going to be water reactive, so it should stay put as you're coloring on top of it. If you want to do this in alcohol marker, feel free. I would recommend printing it. You could print it on a cellulose-based watercolor paper. I've done lots of alcohol marker work on cellulose-based watercolor papers, but you could print it out on a wonderful Bristol or illustration paper, ink it using the same brush pens because they are also alcohol marker safe, and just kind of take it from there. So the materials I'm using today, and I'll link those down in the description below, as I said, are an assortment of Karin markers. I think a while back I bought the 48-piece set and reviewed it here on the channel. And then when Marker Universe was having a 25% off sale in October, I bought a few more colors since they have quite a large range. I don't own all the colors, but I own what I need to paint what I like. I am also using, as we said, the Tombow Fudenosuke brush pens and the Sakura Pigma FB brush pen in a Blick Studio watercolor sketchbook. This is the same sketchbook that I used for my how to draw flower tutorials, if you're interested in that as well. I have a lot of great how to draw stuff here on the channel that get you guys picking up a pencil, picking up a pen, and drawing your own stuff. But I'm also using the Karin Brushmarker Pro markers. You can get those on Marker Universe if you want to get them from a US-based seller. If you don't feel comfortable necessarily ordering from overseas. I believe I ordered my first set from the Karin site and they arrived with no issues, but you know, sometimes I'd rather just order from a known seller. Marker Universe used to be, I want to say, Imagination Ink, the U.S. distributor for Copic. They're no longer the U.S. distributor for Copic, but they do sell a lot of other markers. So we have no affiliation. I don't think they even know I exist. But if you're interested in buying markers that you might not be able to find everywhere else, that's a great place to check because they have a really interesting selection of alcohol and water-based markers. I am also using a ceramic plate from good old Dollar Tree, just a white ceramic plate. I'm doing a technique where I apply a lot of color to that ceramic plate, and then I use my round watercolor brushes. Most of them are the silver black velvet brushes. Those are a mix of synthetic and natural fibers. They're some of my favorite brushes. They're great workhorse watercolor brushes, and I've talked about them a few times here on the channel. So if you're on the market for good watercolor brushes and you don't mind spending a little bit more, but you're going to see a return in quality, those are a great place to start. I'm also using a cup of clean water with a paint puck inside. We're not dealing with pigments today, so scrubbing isn't as important, but I always have a paint puck in my water cup. And I'm also using some paper towels just because it's always handy to have paper towels on hand. So for this technique, as I said, I am applying my color to my ceramic plate, adding varying degrees, varying amounts of water, and then I'm just painting it onto the paper. And I'm using this for like let's say our initial wash, our initial local color. This is going to be our base color. I'm starting with this diluted wash. Now, if you start with the marker itself, you can blend it out, but you're going to end up with areas where you have really strongly saturated color, and you may find color control to be a little bit more challenging as you add more water, because dye-based watercolors tend to be very water reactive, so they can be challenging to layer. My way for controlling that is to start with my really thin glazes, my lightest of washes first, and then build up the color increasingly saturated from there. So I'm going to increase how much ink I use and decrease how much water I use. So I'm starting with a really light blue color. I've talked about doing this in the past to color whites, and I'm using this to color the white icing as well as the white parts on the candy cane and the white part on the peppermint. I pulled out a little bit so you guys can see the technique that I'm going to be using for the majority of this tutorial today. I'm using a reddish brown color, I think it's called henna, for our gingerbread color. And it's okay, don't worry if your initial applications of color are a lot lighter than you want. Keep in mind we're basically applying our highlights right now, and we're going to be building up our color through glazes from here on. So generally you guys see me working with pigment-based watercolors, usually in the form of like tube watercolors or half-pan watercolors. I've reviewed a bunch of those kind of watercolors on the channel, and most of my tutorials focus on those. And what I like about those is they tend to be more down-to-earth colors, and they tend to be granulating, so you do get a little bit of visual interest. I don't paint with dye-based watercolors too often on the channel, mostly because I often struggle to work with them. Now, the exception for that would be dye-based watercolor markers. I really like dye-based watercolor markers. I don't use them nearly enough. I'm a fan of most of the halfway decent ones. I love the Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers. I love the Karin markers. I love the Echo Line markers. Basically, I like water-based markers that come with like a flexible brush that isn't going to tear up your paper surface. So the Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers have those individual nylon bristles. Those are great. I've got some great tutorials here on the channel where I show you how to use them, and they're really easy to blend, and they're really easy to use as well. And they're something that I would recommend for artists of almost any age because they're also going to be non-toxic. So once you've graduated from Crayolas and you're ready for something that's a little bit more nuanced and allows you to do a little bit more blending, the Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers, if you have the budget for them, are a great next step. I also really love the Echo Line water-based markers or watercolor markers. Those are dye-based watercolor markers, and what I love about those is they have that flexible foam rubber nib that you guys hear me praise when it comes to alcohol markers. That's one of my favorite things about alcohol markers is that flexi foam rubber brush, but they are also refillable. You can unscrew the brush collar and you can refill using the corresponding Echo Line ink. I wish they offered empties because I'd love to put some of my Radiant watercolors in those and use those as well. Now, I've heard people say they've done it with Copic sketches. I believe it, but that requires a lot more experimentation than I'm necessarily willing to do, and also Copic sketches are expensive, so that's kind of an investment for something that might not work out very well. Now I have tried putting not only dye-based watercolors in watercolor marker, like those water brushes, but I've also tried putting fountain pennings in those, and I haven't had the best results with those myself. I tend to not go through them fast enough for them to actually be worth doing. They tend to get gunked up and cloggy and then bleed all over the place and leak before I finish using them. So maybe my problem is I'm not like just sitting down and using it until it's empty. That could be my problem. But the Karin brush markers, which we're using today, I don't believe they are refillable. I'm going to have to double check that, so check the description below. I'll check my prior reviews because I'm sure I talked about it in my previous reviews. I don't believe they're refillable. I haven't seen refills for them, but that doesn't mean they aren't refillable. It might just mean they're not available in the US. They have a pretty decent brush nib. It's not as nice as the Eco line, but it's still pretty nice. They're a little bit smaller. They have more like an uni body, like like a ballpoint pen, like a nicer ballpoint pen. It's that kind of form factor. So if you're not comfortable with markers because of the size, that a lot of markers tend to be a little bit bigger than, you know, normal stationery, you might really like these. Here in the US, these are really aimed at brush calligraphers, but like, let's be real, what isn't really aimed at brush calligraphers these days? Like literally every watercolor supply is marketed to brush calligraphers here in the US. Y'all can use them for illustration too though. And they are fun both directly on the paper and used as a watercolor. Using them the way we're using them here, where we apply them to a ceramic plate first and then we add some water and then we apply that color to the paper, allows for a more nuanced application, an application that's really going to look more like traditional watercolor, except with brighter, more candy colored, more vibrant colors. That's one of the things I like about dye-based watercolors, is you get those really bright pops of color that could be fun for like retro inspired illustrations or candy inspired illustrations like what we've got here today. Now, those of you who've watched my channel for a while, you've watched me struggle, I believe twice now, with the Radiant watercolors, and that's why I would love it if either Karin offered empties or Ecoline offered empties, because I'd love to use my Radiant watercolors in a form factor that I'm a little bit more comfortable with. And honestly, the watercolor brush pens like these, it allows me to apply just the right amount of color and just the right amount of water. For me, it's easier to control the ratio and easier to control the proportions with a brush marker like this than it is with a bottle of dye-based watercolor and a dropper. So what I'm doing right now is I'm kind of filling in all the base colors, but this is kind of interesting. So for that window, I wanted it to look like it was like a translucent hot pink, like sponge sugar. So I went ahead and I did kind of a toning layer of one of the hot pinks from the Karin set. Honestly, you guys, I cannot tell you exactly what colors I used. I did not keep that good a track of it, but I don't necessarily want you guys using exactly the colors I'm using here. I want you to use your own imaginations and figure out what colors you would like to use for this so you can make it your own. And if you're working along and you don't want to include the little Kara in the window, you can erase her. It's not going to hurt my feelings. But I wanted to kind of include her because I don't get to do a lot of Kara holiday inspired art. And I thought Kara in a gingerbread house would be too cute to pass up. Who knows? This might end up as a future Christmas card. So I applied a toning layer of that pink that I'm going to want for the window, and I'm going to let it dry before I apply future layers. So one of the keys to working with dye-based watercolors like this is, for the most part, you want to work from light to dark. So I don't just mean like in terms of applying your color to a single area, but I mean like we started with our white, toning it with a really light blue first, before we progress to other colors. Now, I kind of played around with that a little bit because you also want to start from large areas and then work your way progressively to smaller areas. So we used the kind of gingerbready henna color, and we also used one of the greens, and that ended up coloring a lot of this piece. And the reason I did that was it was going to allow me to better gauge the color balance, because even though I did colored inks for this, and colored inks kind of imply what colors you're going to use for what. You don't always have to do what your colored inks show. You can always switch out the colors and either re-ink it or just kind of make it work by using some white gouache. All right, so this is my first layer of color. It's basically like very light washes of color. You could leave it as is like this. Now I'm going to go in, I'm going to start painting the little Kara in the window. So I used one of the skin tone colors that came in the basic 48 set, applied it to my ceramic plate, and then I'm painting it onto the paper itself. So you might think that since the glass is in front of Kara, you would want to paint Kara and then do a glaze of that color on top of it. But what that's going to do is it's going to reactivate all those colors that you painted first, and it's going to turn them to mud. So you want to do your glaze color or your tinting color first, and then paint your other colors on top of that. So at this stage, I am working with a thicker saturation of each color. I'm still applying it to my ceramic plate. I'm still adding some water, but I'm adding less water here. So those of you at home, you might be tempted to use a water brush for this. You totally can. I have control issues with water brushes. Like, I'm kind of heavy-handed, so I tend to over squeeze them anyway. And then my hands get hot and they start leaking water. So I have a hard time with water brushes, but I've seen people do some amazing things that I cannot do with water brushes. So that could be a good one for this. If you do use a water brush, I recommend you scrub it out good in between colors. But for me, I'm working at home. A clean cup of water and a couple of rounds will work perfectly for this. So I basically just kept track of what colors I used for what, and I'm just adding a darker saturation of each color once the initial layer is dried. Now, you could do this on a cotton rag watercolor paper. That is your choice. Got a couple reasons why it's not necessarily a choice I would make. One, dye-based watercolors tend to be, they aren't always, but they tend to be, because they are dye-based, more light fugitive, more likely to fade than your pigment-based watercolors. Now, this isn't always 100% true. It's going to depend on the colors, but like those hot pinks, those really bright pinks you guys see me using, those are going to fade really fast. So to me, there's no point in doing this illustration on really nice watercolor paper when all I really want to do for this is just scan it and have a digital copy of it once we finish with this tutorial. The other reason is sometimes cellulose paper has properties that you want, properties that you can use. I find that the texture on cellulose papers, because it's kind of an embossed texture rather than the actual fibers of the paper, or even like the linen the felts that they use to press the paper, gives the paper a texture. That's not the case with cellulose. This is done by using an embossing roller to kind of give it a texture. So the paper tends to be denser, it tends to absorb less of the color, but it also tends to dry way faster than cotton rag paper. So cellulose papers can be great if you're doing really light watercolor sketches, or if you want your paper to dry really quickly. If you're impatient like me and you like to paint fast, cellulose papers can be great because it doesn't really absorb the water the way a cotton rag paper does. The water basically stays kind of on the surface of the paper and it evaporates out into the atmosphere. So cellulose paper definitely has its pros and its cons. And like with any art supply, if there's a specific reason you want to use that material, it's probably going to work well for that. So not every art supply is going to be a perfect all-rounder. So don't expect every art supply to like solve all your art supply problems. That's like my #1 problem when people are like, recommend watercolor stuff to me. Because I'll always be like, such and such is good for such and such, and such and such is good for this. And you want to use it in this use case, but maybe not in that one. And people will be like, well, what's something that's just good for everything? And it's like, well, you're going to have a few things that are like decently mediocre at everything. And those are a great way to get started because you're going to be able to produce decent looking, consistent results. But they're not going to be good. You're not going to necessarily be super impressed with that same art supply a year from now once you've improved. So that's why it's kind of good to know what your options are, and it's good to know what art supplies are great for what instances. So something else that's good about cellulose watercolor paper is that when you're working with dye-based watercolors like we're using today, they tend to be very prone to reactivating, so you can kind of smooth out areas or blend out shading if you decide you don't want it or you want to kind of adjust the shading. It's a little bit easier to do that on a cellulose paper than it would be onto a cotton rag paper, where the dye is going to soak into the fibers and it'll probably stain the fibers, and you're going to have a much harder time getting that color to actually move. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I kept track of all the colors I used for my base colors, and now I'm just doing a more saturated mix of those same colors on top of the original colors. So this is a pretty easy tutorial in terms of color theory and thinking about colors. We're not doing anything weird or fun with the lighting. We're not doing anything weird or fun with the shadows. It is basically just variations on a local color. So for Kara's mouth, hair, and skin, I painted base colors. I'm going to allow those to dry. I'm going to add one more layer of color to her hair just to get a darker mix, since she would be inside this gingerbread house and the lighting would be a bit darker, so we wouldn't have as many highlights. But if you want to change how you handle that, that's totally up to you, like I said before. But I'm not going to add too many additional layers to her face, since again, she's behind this tinted pink glass, and I feel like you would lose a lot of the detail and a lot of the nuance viewing someone through pink glass like that. It's just pink enough that it really adds some tone and some shadow to the colors that we've applied on top of it. So in general, I recommend you allow your base colors, your base layers to dry before you start applying the marker directly to the paper. And there's a couple of reasons for that. It's going to allow you to control your blend because you can always go back in with a brush of clean water like I'm demonstrating here and blend that color out a little bit rather than it being kind of an uncontrolled blend into whatever is still damp on the paper. And there are instances where you would utilize an uncontrolled blend like that. So I'm not shooting it completely out of hand. I'm just offering an alternative to that. Also, if you are working with almost any kind of brush pen, with the exception of the ones that have the individual bristles, like the Clean Color Real Brush or the Pentel dye-based brush pens, you're going to end up abrading your paper surface. You're going to end up tearing up your paper surface, even with really gentle brushes. Like this one's a pretty mild-mannered brush. Water and then scrubbing tends to tear up the paper surface, but if you allow it to dry first and then do your direct application and then blend that out while it's still wet, it's going to be a lot easier to control. You want to avoid tearing up your paper surface because it's also going to make subsequent layers kind of unpredictable. It can make the paper pulpy, it can make it behave kind of like toilet paper, frankly, and it can just make painting on it a real pain. So in general, when I'm working with watercolor or water-based anything, I really try to avoid tearing up my paper surface. So I'm applying my markers directly to the surface because this is going to give us the most saturated version of that color possible. This is the full intensity of that color. So we basically did 3 layers today. Our toning layer, our first layer where we kind of establish what color everything's going to be. Then we started putting in some of the shadows and filling in some areas with a second more saturated layer. And now we're applying our darkest shadow of that same color using the brush directly. So if you want to get even darker with this, if you want to throw in some contrast, you can by switching what marker colors you're using. When it comes to dye-based stuff, I kind of shy away from doing that because it can reactivate. And when we're talking about really loose, really thin glazes, it has a real tendency to reactivate. So I find, since I have control issues, as you guys probably know, I find it's easier to control what I'm doing like this by just using the same color for the most part, unless I have a reason to want to introduce another color. Maybe it's casting a light or it's behind a tinted glass or something like that. So at this stage, I am pretty much just adding in like slight cast shadows or adding in some shadows to help create more definition or more delineation. So I'm applying shadows like underneath the frosting or underneath the candies on the trees, stuff like that. So it's a more pronounced, more saturated cast shadow for this. So this is just my personal opinion, but it is kind of based off of years of reviewing markers, both alcohol and water-based. I feel like water-based and watercolor markers, when it comes to illustrators and illustration, when we're talking about reviews, they tend to get kind of the short end of the stick compared to like tube watercolors and compared to like alcohol markers. Water-based markers can be a great addition to your studio or a great alternative to alcohol markers. They're not going to be able to do everything that your alcohol markers can do, but your alcohol markers can't do everything that your water-based markers can do. The main difference when we're talking about dye-based color is going to be whether the solvent is an alcohol or an ethanol or water/glycerin based. So there's a lot of commonalities between alcohol markers and water-based markers when we're talking about the types of color they have to offer. Now, some of the pros of water-based markers, like these Karin Brushmarker Pro markers, is that water is the solvent. So they are typically less toxic. You're not going to have as many fume issues. I know in some of my reviews, I've talked about certain brands of alcohol markers being really whiffy. It means they have really, really strong solvent or alcohol scents, and they have a tendency to make me dizzy. You want to work in a well-ventilated area. And when you're messing with art supplies, I always recommend you work in a well-ventilated area. I mean, airflow is just good for you. But with water-based markers like these, you're going to be less likely to get a headache from the fumes because they typically don't have fumes. So if you're scent sensitive, these would be a better choice for you probably than alcohol markers. I mean, all artists vary, and I'm sure there's going to be someone in the comments who's like, I'm really sensitive to scents, but I love alcohol markers. And I mean, that's me too. Like, if I use markers for too long, I can sometimes get a migraine just from the smell, but I still love them. Water-based markers, though, are way less likely to do that to you. They may also be way easier for you to blend because water is your solvent. You're not worrying about using a blender marker, and you can still blend your water-based markers color into color. You can either blend them out using a ceramic sheet. There's a lot of people who do Tombow marker art who utilize using like a ceramic plate to get like really nice blends. You can blend them using a Teflon sheet like I've got on my desk, or you can blend them onto the paper or blend them marker to marker. I mean, those are techniques you can use with a lot of alcohol markers too, but people sometimes forget that those are techniques that you can also use with water-based markers. You can also do a lot of fun reactivation stuff with water-based markers, just using a bottle of water in a spray bottle and spritzing it onto your paper. You can get fun effects by sprinkling in salt, or you can even sprinkle in some rubbing alcohol and you get this like neat sucker kind of effect, like a tentacle sucker or an octopus sucker, or like bubbles or glow effects. So water-based markers really have a lot to offer. They can be less expensive than alcohol markers. You know, it's your mileage may vary sort of thing. I mean, if we're comparing an Ohuhu alcohol marker to an Ecoline watercolor marker, the Ecolines are going to cost more than the Ohuhus. But if you're comparing Ecoline markers to Copic markers, the Ecoline markers are going to cost less than the Copic markers and will probably last about the same length of time. One of the downsides to water-based markers, especially water-based watercolor markers, is they just don't always have the store coverage that alcohol markers have. You're not going to have as much selection at Michael's. They mostly just have the Tombow ABTs and a few Ecolines, whereas they carry several brands of alcohol markers. And your local mom and pop art supply shop may carry Copics and Prismacolors, and maybe some other brands of alcohol markers, but they may not carry, say, the Karin Brushmarker Pros. That's why I mentioned Marker Universe earlier on. They carry Posca style markers, the poster tempera paint markers. They carry acrylic markers. They carry water-based markers. They carry alcohol markers. So if you just enjoy markers, they're a great source for a variety of markers to spark your inspiration. There also used to be Marker Supply Co. in Nashville, and I've ordered from them a few times and I've had good results, but I have no idea what COVID has done to them because they were a really small business when I was ordering from them a couple years ago. So as you guys can see at this point, I'm basically just using the same water-based marker, the same Karin Brushmarker Pro marker that I used for the other two stages. Now I'm just applying it directly to the area, blending it out when necessary, just to get a softer transition so it's not so much like, well, bam, you used a marker. And at this point, I'm going in with white gouache just to add back in some highlights, add back in some contrast and some white definition, and to like add some reflection to the clear candy window that Kara's peering out of. I had a lot of fun painting and rendering this piece, not only for y'all, but also for myself. It was just a pleasure to get to work with these markers and to get to work with such vibrant colors, especially since I've been doing a lot of watercolor stuff on the channel recently. This was a fun twist on watercolor. Hopefully I showed you guys some techniques that are new to you, and maybe I helped spark some inspiration, or maybe I turned you on to a product that you've never used before. Either way, I had a lot of fun with this, and I hope you guys will give water-based and watercolor markers a second try if you blew them off in the past. If you're like me and you already knew that water-based markers are pretty dang cool, then hey, we can just be in the cool artist club together. So that about wraps up another art tutorial from Natto Soup Studio. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope it was useful, helpful, and informative for you guys, even if it's a little bit late for many people's Christmas. For some of us, Christmas goes on until January 6th, so to me, I've got plenty of time. But I know for some folks, Christmas ends at the stroke of midnight as soon as it turns December 26th. So regardless of whether you're a January 6th kind of person or a December 26th person or even a, hey, it actually happened in March kind of person, I hope you guys had a Merry Christmas and a Happy Holidays. Bye, guys.